Today, I thought we could talk about the certain concepts I've encountered in Carlos Castaneda's works. I'm just curious, for those of you with your videos on, has anyone read Carlos Castaneda? Oh, Susanna has. Oh, and Nina. Okay, great. Karen, you have not, but there's a character in the book named Don Gennaro. And he's a pretty awesome character. So anyways, I'll just go ahead and get started. But you know, I don't know if all of you've seen, but these advertisements of BetterHelp. There's BetterHelp is the most popular online therapy platform today. And I think their advertisements are sort of interesting because they really just simplify what the public perceives therapy as. They just have very sort of touching images of someone sad and alone. Oh, I'm getting feedback. And they're, on their phone texting their therapist. Oh, Monica, hi. It's so long. And they're texting their therapist and they're saying something like, excuse me just a moment. They're saying something on their phone like, hey, today was really a rough day. And they're crying, and the therapist responds, I'm sorry to hear that. Want to talk about what happened? In another advertisement, you see the same concept. The patient is texting saying, I've been feeling panicked and anxious again. The therapist says, I'm here for you. Let's have a video session tonight. Another advertisement just says, BetterHelp, support when you need it the most. Another one says, there is no shame in getting help. BetterHelp also advertises that therapists are available by message anytime that you can, anytime. And you can also replace your therapist as many times as you want, as quickly as you want. So that's sort of what's selling for therapy today. And it says something about what therapy is, or at least what the consumers might want therapy to be, according to popular opinion. It's support, it's sympathy, it's compassion. It's one person in distress asking another to be available whenever they need. It's a person crying and alone, texting on their phone to someone who says the sweetest possible thing imaginable in return. It's therapy, simply put, according to popular opinion, is comfort. It's comforting. But is that what therapy ought to be? Or is that what all therapy is? It's certainly not what psychoanalysts have conceptualized therapy to be. From the beginning, psychoanalysts have always taken the view that therapy is there to help you confront some of the more difficult truths about your life. Whether that be things you're guilty about, things you don't want to look at, things that have happened in your past that are painful to you, conflicts you have with your desires. And, there's always these questions that bring you to confront issues. And psychoanalysts in particular have not taken this view necessarily that it's therapy is primarily about comfort. If it is, it's in the service of confronting difficult things. The means by which psychoanalysts help people tends to be that there are these long conversations about the patient's life. The patient comes in with a particular complaint, and the psychoanalyst talks to them about that, talks about the history of their complaint, but also the history of that person, the history of their relationships. And why do they do that? They do that in the pursuit of a certain type of healing, one that may lead to a particular form of happiness. The aim of psychoanalysis, according to Freud, was put in this way. It was to convert the patient's hysterical misery into common unhappiness, thereby allowing them to confront their suffering with greater courage and less defensiveness. Through the relationship with the analyst, the patient becomes better equipped to confront the suffering endemic to life. Michael Thompson, who you probably all know, in his paper on the enigma of happiness, has argued that this aim of psychoanalysis aligns itself with the pursuit of a form of happiness called by the Greeks ataraxia, a term for happiness that describes a state of unperturbed equanimity. Michael has also argued that eudaimonia, a form of happiness that comes from flourishing or a form of being successful in life, is supported by ataraxia, but more indirectly. Eudaimonia requires that we take advantage of chance opportunities that one must be open enough to seize. The psychoanalytic pursuit of ataraxia sets the foreground, whereupon we do not resist suffering, and therefore do not unwittingly defend against experience more generally. Eudaimonia, on the other hand, cannot be pursued directly. It is something that comes in part by chance, but we also have to be open enough to see the opportunity when it comes and seize it. Or perhaps it's more like we allow the opportunity to take a hold of us. After all, the term eudaimonia has a mythological roots which suggest that this form of happiness comes in the form of a good daemon spirit possessing you. Another aspect of eudaimonia is that it requires that you have an aim, a pursuit to desire. And since any pursuit can end in frustration or disappointment, it comes with risk. If you are defended against suffering to begin with, you might not tolerate such a risk. The risk of disappointment, or the risk of failure to get what you want. Ataraxia then is the more direct aim of psychoanalysis, to not avoid the suffering inherent to our lives and therefore achieve something like equanimity. Eudaimonia, on the other hand, is a form of happiness occasioned by a successful life, and is something we might have the courage to pursue if we do not foreclose upon experience through defensiveness. In 1972, Carlos Castaneda's book, Journey to Ixtlan, presents its own approach to happiness. It was published as a continuation of his account of his apprenticeship with a Yaqui Native American sorcerer named Don Juan. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Castaneda claimed that his books were reports of true stories and maintained that his entire life. However, no evidence that I'm aware of has ever been ascertained that Don Juan really existed. Nonetheless, the philosophical and psychological implications of the quote, "the lessons of Don Juan," are remarkable. The book Journey to Ixtlan outlines much of Castaneda's philosophy, particularly a way of life he calls the way of the warrior, an approach to life that outlines his own view of happiness and describes his methods for achieving that happiness. These methods appear to incorporate an existential sensibility. They also seem to completely, at times, contradict psychotherapeutic technique, and yet they present a compelling approach to a good life. So much so that, many of you may know that Castaneda was incredibly, popular. Everyone was reading him in the 70s. But to become a warrior, which is basically synonymous for a good life in this book, Don Juan says you must become a hunter of power. But what does that mean? Castaneda seems to use power in an idiosyncratic way. According to, and to save you a little confusion, Don Juan and Castaneda are largely interchangeable when I'm talking about them. But Don Juan always very clearly represents the philosophy. Sometimes Castaneda is the person talking to Don Juan, but since Castaneda was the author of the entire thing, sometimes I'll be referring to his ideas as Castaneda's ideas, and sometimes as Don Juan's. I probably could have made that cleaner, but so anyways, Castaneda seems to use power in an idiosyncratic way. According to Don Juan, it is not possible to say how power comes or what it really is. It is nothing, and yet it makes marvels appear before your very eyes. Power is something in oneself, something that controls one's acts, and yet obeys one's command. I understand him to mean that to hunt power is to live a life of wonder and passion, to act intentionally, and to accept one's place in an awesome and mysterious world. To hunt power is to search out what in the world can take a hold of you and to become accessible to it so that you can also be an agent of it. Although this is not Castaneda's particular angle, I think love seems to be a form of power in this sense. Love is something we say we fall into, we fall in love. Love is something that controls one's acts if you let it, and yet becomes the most potent expression of your own desire. To hunt power is also not dissimilar to the pursuit of eudaimonia. One must be open to opportunities that arise and be prepared to take them. You pay attention to your experience in the world and allow events in the world to move you and call you into action. But what is the type of openness required to find this sort of power? Oh, I see. Feedback there. To find this sort of power or these opportunities for eudaimonia, and how does someone achieve that sort of openness? So while the psychoanalytic methods focus on working through defenses to suffering so that you can confront them and not be so guarded against their possibility in the future and be willing to therefore take risks, Castaneda takes a completely different approach. Castaneda's Don Juan argues that in order to be happy, we need to take responsibility for our actions and embrace the world as a mysterious and wonderful place. To do that is not quite so simple, though. He says his method for that is that he suggests that we erase our personal history in order to disentangle oneself from the expectations of others and drop any sense of self-importance, which interferes with participation in the world. At one point, Don Juan explains a direct connection between who we take ourselves to be and how we experience the world. He says, you see, we only have two alternatives. We either take everything for sure and real, or we don't. If we follow the first, we end up bored to death with ourselves and with the world. If we follow the second and erase personal history, we create a fog around us, a very exciting and mysterious state in which nobody knows where the rabbit will pop out, not even ourselves.
Oh, don't forget some brown rice.
Oh. I'm going to try to mute you guys. Okay, so, I think it's this idea of personal history here. It has both to do with one's relation it has primarily to do with one's relationship to oneself, that you're taking it that you don't know who you are. And that also mirrors a certain relationship he's suggesting to have with the world, that you don't know with certainty how the world is. But he attacks it first at this very personal angle, that when we all feel that we have this personal history, that we have places we're from, the family we're identified with, cultures we're identified with, all these identities. His take on personal history in particular is what Winnicott or Laing would talk about as a false self. He's talking about personal history as a problem because it fixes you in your mind to yourself, but also very much to other people. And it starts to constrain how you behave with other people. Now, he has like these very dramatic recommendations to Carlos, Don Juan does in the book. He's saying, Carlos, anyone who's known you for a long time, get rid of them. Anyone who thinks they know who you are, just cut them out from your life. Now, in real life, I think it's a little severe, but I think what I take him to mean is that this way of identifying who you are, knowing who you are, and being attached to how other people see you, it's powerful and it can dominate you. And he's not alone in thinking that. Of course, Winnicott had a lot to say about false selves and how they constrain you, and how this social self, this way of being in relationship to others, often dominates your expression. Laing had even more extreme ways of putting it, that you might be afraid of someone petrifying you with their gaze, that they might turn you into stone just by how they look at you. But he's saying that erasing personal history, not identifying too strongly with anything, not being too attached to how other people see you, not only allows you to have a more wonderful relationship with yourself, but also a sort of erasing personal history sets this sort of foreground for wonder altogether. We are either certain about ourselves and the world, and therefore our passion for it dies, or we embrace the mystery of ourselves and the world, and we experience wonder and the possibility of passion. After all, how can one feel passionate about something that one is bored with? Castaneda also feels that our relationship with death is central to happiness. He claims that we need to use death as an advisor in order to help us live fully, never forgetting that our death can come at any time and that it will be final when it does. This relationship with death as an advisor helps us assume, according to him, to assume ultimate responsibility for our actions, because every action is a decision we make in the face of our inevitable death. He says, to assume the responsibility of one's decisions means that one is ready to die for them. It doesn't matter what the decision is. Nothing could be more or less serious than anything else. You see, in a world where death is the hunter and can take you any time, there are no small or big decisions. There are only decisions that we make in the face of our inevitable death. For Don Juan, this is essential. One cannot be happy while putting everything on hold, neglecting one's mortality and imagining that they have all the time in the world. To him, quote, happiness is to act with the full knowledge that you don't have time. Therefore, your acts have a peculiar power. Essentially, the power of someone fully committed to what they are doing. And finally, he provides illustrations for becoming what he calls accessible to power, which is a form of allowing the world to affect you. and to not reduce it to a boring place where you attempt to control it. There was this very interesting story in the book where Carlos, just to make this a bit clearer, the format of the book is that Carlos is in this apprenticeship with Don Juan, and Don Juan takes him out into the desert and explains this way of life to Carlos all the time. Carlos is always this sort of this cynic about the ideas, and he doesn't buy into them. He's always questioning Don Juan. The ideas don't make enough sense to Carlos, but all along he's sort of impressed with Don Juan and keeps going. So anyways, it's in that setting that Carlos goes on an adventure with Don Juan out into the desert. And the idea is that they're hunting power. And in Don Juan's world, you have the powers of the desert, which is the wind. You have the sun. There are sort of spirits that it's animistic worldview. Where the world is alive. So he's taking Carlos out, and they do all these really sort of attention-grabbing things to get the attention of the spirits of that desert. And then once they do, the wind starts besieging them, always hounding them, pushing them and pulling them. And at one point, Don Juan points out to Carlos, look, the power, it's there, right in front of you, right there. And it was sort of twilight at this point. And they look over and they see something that looks like something sort of alarming. It's this shape that looks like it might be maybe a dying animal. And Don Juan says, Carlos, what do you see? He says, yeah, it's a dying animal. It looks like its feet are up and it's about to it's in the last spasms of its life. And Don Juan says, oh, be careful, that's when it's at its most dangerous. And he says, no, it's about to pounce, it looks like. And it's moving in this strange way that it's hard to understand. So Carlos is explaining what he's seeing to Don Juan, and then all of a sudden, Carlos laughs and he goes and he walks over to the shape and he says, Don Juan, look, it's just a branch being blown by the wind. And Don Juan says, okay, come over here, stop talking, shut up. And he says, Carlos was like, what are you talking about? I figured it out. It's great. And Don Juan says, look, don't think you've done anything impressive here. The wind blew real power into that branch. And for a while you could see that. But, you've just basically ruined that opportunity. He's wasted a beautiful power by basically realizing that it was just a branch being blown by the wind. But what does this have to do with happiness? Don Juan's vision of happiness is one where you and the world in which you live are alive and full of mysterious power. The vision that Carlos represents is one in which the world is continuous and stable. In Carlos's version, the pursuit of knowledge and control is paramount. He wants to master the world, to never be afraid of it, and to be able to use it when he wants, to get what he wants out of it. The idea that there is power in the world that goes beyond his understanding disturbs him, and he resists it at every turn. For Don Juan, how the, quote, branch appeared to Carlos was when it was an animal and all those different things, was as real as anything else. It's as real as the realization that it was just a branch made out of wood being blown by the wind. Carlos experienced something powerful until the moment he realized it was just a branch. Consider, for example, the obsessional patient's view of love. Is this love real or not? Is often a question. Is it a good idea or not that I'm in love with this person? Am I really in love with this person? Or is it just a neurochemical trick of my brain making me feel this way? Is it just infatuation? Perhaps things like marriage are just a contract. Love is just an exchange of favors or filling each other's needs. You see, it's so easy for many people to make the most powerful force in the world reduced to something that has almost no impact. How much more we do this with everything else that's even less powerful. The wind, we understand it to be just the movement of hot and cold air. Water is just certain kinds of molecules. Breathing is just the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The world, understood in this way, has no power over me. It's just a bunch of matter. And in fact, why speak about experience at all? There's just stuff happening. It doesn't mean anything. But how does all this relate to therapy? I think it relates in two ways, by means and by aim. Castaneda's work suggests something about one of the psychoanalysts' means, which is interpretation. He suggests that how we interpret the world is up to us, whether we choose to live in a world that is dead, safe, and boring, or one that is mysterious, dangerous, and wonderful is a choice we make in the face of our deaths. In the case of psychoanalysts, this observation, I think, can be an enlightening one, because it also has implications for how we interpret to our patients. The choice is similar. Are our interpretations aimed to soothe, to comfort, and to make certain aspects of the patient's experience, or are they aimed to open, to raise questions, and to make uncertain, to allow more room for desire and experience? The former is usually what patients have come to expect from modern therapy, just like what we see in those BetterHelp advertisements. It's more comforting. And however wise it might be at times to be comforting, and it's not that there's anything clear that that's bad, it by itself fails to aim at a happy life. A comfortable life is not one that is a compelling case for a happy life. Psychoanalysis has also embraced uncomfortable interpretations that expose us to experience that is painful. So in that way, we'd agree with Castaneda. It's the aim, though it might be different, it aims at something like ataraxia, where eudaimonia may also follow. Castaneda's work does not address suffering in the same way, sort of skips over that. But it focuses on how one takes responsibility for their choices in the face of death and how one aims at a good life. His emphasis on hunting for power describes a special relationship a person can have with themselves and the world, wherein nothing is taken for granted or for certain, and yet one is always ready to respond to something that moves them. I take this to be an emphasis on and a particular interpretation of eudaimonia, which describes a shift in emphasis or a shift in aim between the two disciplines. I mean, if you call Castaneda's thing a discipline. But we can leave it maybe as an open question as to whether this form of flourishing or aiming at a good life or eudaimonia is something that can be more directly emphasized in therapy, or whether the more modest aim of converting hysterical misery to common unhappiness is as far as we should go. That's it. We'll have plenty of time for discussion or thoughts that you guys might have.
Well, James, let me jump in there. This is, given my age now, getting a little older, this question of happiness doesn't seem to have the same, I don't think, the meaning for me as it did when I was younger. It might simply be because I've achieved more than I'd ever thought I would have achieved in all aspects of my life. So it's left me feeling somewhat empty. And so I guess the shift about what is happiness versus what's a meaningful life has been, I think, something that's been driving me more, now in my life than it has in the past, and having an intimate relation to dying, meaning that we're living toward our death right now, is even more existentially anxious, so to speak. The other thought is that, when people talk about a method of achieving happiness or whatever you're desiring in life, I almost find that to be inauthentic. I mean, looking for a method to achieve something doesn't like just follow a step-by-step thing. Or do that, or think that, or live your life that way. It's like it strips everything of any personalized responsibility or authenticity, or just having to stumble your way through living, making mistakes, learning from them. So it's, I don't know where I'm going with this, but these are my free associations. On one hand, though, when you think about bringing it back to the therapy room, usually, from a psychoanalytic point of view, we don't necessarily want to impose our own agenda on a patient. At the same time, I can say that I genuinely would desire for my patients to, be happier or live a better life, but it's certainly not a requirement. And then at the same time, I have to curtail my own sense of self and my own personality in being available to another person in that way, to allow them their own, authentic process of becoming. So with all that jabbering.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think neither. I think neither. I know I was talking about means. It's interesting because neither of these sort of approaches, in a way, what Don Juan, in fiction was doing with Carlos Castaneda, or what psychoanalysts ideally are proposing to do is meant to be a technique or a step-by-step method. The idea instead is that you have, certain things that you, certain ways of sort of drawing someone out, but even that's not really totally prescribed. And as far as happiness being an aim, that itself is so vague, because if eudaimonia is something like flourishing and a successful life, that's really defined by the person, so it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be sort of prescriptive in that sense. But I still think, that part of my question about this whole thing is that, I kind of think that I love reading Castaneda's books because it seems like it's sort of cajoles you into this thinking about being open to and active in your participation in the world, that the world is this wonderful place that can just grab a hold of you, and it's not all about your premeditated designs, and in fact it's letting those go that allows something to grab a hold of you. And but I guess in psychoanalysis the modest aim is always that there's suffering and experience already there in the patient. You're helping, you're inquiring into that. You're talking about what's present, basically what's being talked about, what you are picking up from what the patient is saying, and that helps them to confront certain things. And so I think it may be that that's as far as therapy ought to go. But I guess even in this idea of eudaimonia or hunting power in Castaneda's language, and that's just a hypothesis I have that they're the same somehow. But I think even in that idea, it's not prescriptive. It's not suggesting that we know what that means. But I find that the things that he used in the book, like using death, that we don't have time to waste, because I think that's remarkable, that how easy it is to forget that I am going to die. Or I always imagine that very clearly it will happen when I'm old, but I don't know that either. And thinking about that, I found is very helpful. So, if a patient brings up, for instance, death, I'm scared of it and that sort of thing, some therapists may aim to then help them find a sort of comfortable place with it. Castaneda's point would be to say, right, you are going to die. It could happen any moment. That's how are you going to live then?
James, I'm finding the discussion really timely for me. I've been asked to mentor a first-year course on brief therapy and CBT at the university where I teach. And I'm working with one of the instructors and seeing if we might use a depth lens to see CBT and brief therapy as maybe the initiatory step rather than the prescriptive way CBT and brief therapy tends to help the person adapt rather than go into the depth. So this is very timely for me.
Oh, good.
Just exploring, could we look at these more prescriptive types of therapy, such as brief therapy and CBT, from the depth lens? And if so, what would that look like? And could we then initiate clients, so to speak, into a deeper process in this more prescriptive manner that seems to be more acceptable at this time? So I'm just wondering everybody's thoughts on that. I would really appreciate contributions.
Does this topic make you think of anything related to short-term therapy, or?
Are you asking me or just in general?
Yeah. Oh, yes, you, Susanna. Yeah.
Well, I in terms of short term, I mainly use art. I'm an art therapist, so I'm thinking if I can get people to be bitten by the art bug, then they might continue their own journey. So somehow, very sneaky in a way, bringing it in as if it's short term. Here are the reasons it's stress relief. It's the neuro blah blah blah. Do use all the lingo. Getting people then involved in their own creative process as if it's grief therapy or CBT. And then if that initiates something, then there's a further process. That would be my hope.
Well, I always feel like the first sessions with people are, I worked, at a clinic for a long time, and a lot of people would come from insurance and that sort of thing. And they always expect you to be part of a healthcare system and to do it very quickly. But I always felt that I was, there sort of putting some breadcrumbs out, to see if they wanted to go further.
Yeah.
Hi, Nina.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, by the way.
Oh, okay. Am I still muted yet?
No, Susanna, you're good.
Okay.
I think Nina was raising her hand.
Oh, yeah, please contribute. I'd love to hear people's thoughts.
Well, Susanna, when you first spoke, I thought you said grief therapy.
Well, that too.
Well, yeah, because most of the people who get referred to me are dealing with grief after a suicide loss. But often what happens is that, particularly once the grief is either integrated or at least manageable, it opens them up to, sort of deeper exploration of not only their relationships with the one that they lost, but, that goes beyond that. So in some ways, I don't know whether CBT could have that same thing, because CBT is kind of, it's very focused, which isn't to say that it's not useful at times, but at least the grief therapy, the grief work does to open people up to both deeper work and more existential work, because death figures very prominently in that.
So it's interesting to explore, what could CBT have a role somewhere in all of this? Could it be part of a larger trajectory, I guess, is my own personal private research in being asked to do this. Like, I don't actually use CBT or even believe in it. But since I'm in that position, could we find a use for it? Could we find its place that wouldn't be this shutdown, this prescriptive, this more protective way? That's what I'm looking. Where does it fit, or does it? How could it fit?
I think where I find it helpful is when people are sort of discovering patterns in their thought processes and the feelings that go along with them, and sort of using some of the CBT, not necessarily the language, but to say, in this type of state, these are the thoughts and feelings that are common. But if you're in a different state, I stay away from things like rational and irrational, because don't get me started on that. But
I'm with you there.
And so sort of use the way in which the types of thoughts are understood as a way to leverage the deeper work. Then about maybe being able to transform the thoughts that are common in this state to maybe be rich and more varied, something like that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Chris wrote something. Do you want to say to it, Chris? Or I could read it as well. Anyways, yeah, Chris was saying the Castaneda story relates to realizing what you think reality is only an idea of it, and it's not a concrete certainty. And when you relinquish that certainty, it lets it be a mystery.
Yeah, nice.
It's like this. Everyone can say what you're doing, and
I'm not sure how much desire you can have without there being some mystery. You know, actually, in terms of being with patients, I think one of the things that's really interesting, it reminds, a lot of Castaneda stuff reminds me of Bion's recommendation to let go of, you know, memory, desire, understanding when you're with patients, because to do that, you know, just keeps it completely open as to who this person is. Like when Castaneda is saying, erase your personal history. Well, as a therapist, you can do that for your patient in a way. You can say, I'm going to interact with you now as though basically I don't know anything for certain about your personal history. Things may come to my mind, but I'm not going to fixate on them as if I can deduce from them that I know something. And that allows you to be completely free with who you are. I mean, if you have any friends, or old friends, or also family members who say things like, listen, I know who you are, you know, or you get the sense from them that they feel that way, that they know exactly who you are. It's hard to maintain those relationships, I think. You find that they're really constraining. You really kind of need the people, you know, who love you to let you be however you are in the moment, you know, to always be changing and to be free. So, you know, Castaneda's point is not from the therapist perspective, it's from the person. Is saying, if you live in such a way where you always are trying to live up to some sort of ego ideal, or live according to people's expectations of you, if you let yourself be dominated by that, then you're not going to have a very good life.
Yeah, too constricted by those norms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we can start to wrap up early if we're feeling like it. Is there any other comments or questions? Marisol. Oh, and you're muted, so you just have to make, yeah. Oh, but I can't hear you still. I don't know. Can anyone else hear Marisol? No. Oh, Marisol, we can't hear you. Uh-oh. No, I'd love to hear what you're going to say.
Or type it in the chat.
Yeah, can you type it in the chat maybe, Marisol? Of course, it might be that there's something wrong with your microphone, or do you see the chat box at the bottom? Oh, yes, depends on how we define happiness. If I understand happiness as building one, building one's character, then what Don Juan says makes sense. Okay. Yeah. I think I guess happiness in a lot of the ways we're talking about. So as far as I understand it, when I was speaking about eudaimonia, or even when Carlos writes explicitly about happiness in the book, it seems to really relate to more like a good life, a life that's worthwhile. Maybe character has a lot to do with that. I know that's all sort of wrapped up into one thing, the question of a good life and character are intertwined. I mean, I think the whole idea of ethics unifies those concepts, that ethics is a desire to live a good life. Happiness is what you're aiming at. Happiness represents a life well lived, and it has to do with having a good character. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a life that's worthwhile is lived by one with solid character. I mean, someone could correct me, but I think that was Aristotle's idea. Well, thanks, Marisol. Yeah, that's great. Oh, and Katya has something to say. Katya says, in the clinic, it's apparent that human suffering is caused by connections to the past. Thinking that way, removing history, may be to review those connections and re-signify them. It's freeing self to experience life. Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because in Castaneda's thing, he's almost suggesting you could just toss it aside. But I'm not sure that's really how it works. That actually, by reviewing it and by thinking it over and working through your past, you don't feel that it has such a hold on you. Like Freud's idea of the repetition compulsion, something that's repressed actually becomes compulsive and repeats itself. So you can't just toss something away. That would be a form of repression or denial, or but to think it through and to work through it. Yeah.
Perhaps it's the emphatic that he says toss it all away because that startles us.
Right.
And we might come to what you're, oh yeah, okay, I'm awake now, and then move into what you're suggesting. I like that progression.
Yeah, I don't take all of his writing to be spot on. I mean, and I think a lot of what's valuable about it is it does what you're saying, Susanna, that it just sort of wakes you up to something. Well, this is interesting. Yeah. Okay. So what you're saying, Katya, is Castaneda uses the term ruthless as position. No matter what happens, it's time to live. Right. Yeah. It's the world is ruthless. You have to be ruthless in your actions, be committed to them without regret or remorse or resentment. There's no time for any of that in his view. Marisol, okay, regarding CBT, clients come to us in various stages of their growth. I see CBT as an entryway for those who are needing relief from suffering. During cognitive restructuring, deeper meanings could gradually be addressed until the client is ready to go deeper and build character.
Nice.
So
Thank you. Can I quote you when I? Thank you very much.
Oh, that's nice. Okay. Well, yeah, it was a fairly on the shorter end of a presentation, so we can end a little early today. But thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate you guys attending and having the conversation. So thanks so much.